All right, so invasive species in Michigan. I'm Kevin. I'm with DEQ. And what you'll learn today. First, we'll talk about what an invasive species is. There's a little more to it than maybe what you think, so I'll at least tell you how the state defines invasive species and an easy way to look at it as a student and as a educator. Oops, let me go back. We'll talk about why they're bad, why we care. Then we'll transition to how they get here, and we'll kind of land on what you can do to help as educators, as students, and just as a general public, just as a citizen of Michigan. So let's start with what is an invasive species. There's lots of different names that we hear. We hear non-native, we hear non-indigenous, we hear exotic. Sometimes people talk about noxious weeds. What does that actually mean, and what are we talking about when we talk about invasive species? Well, in Michigan, the way the state of Michigan defines invasive species is one, there's two components, two really important components. One, they're non-native, so not originally from Michigan. And then two, they cause harm. Cause harm to what? Well, the economy, the environment, and sometimes human health. So those are the two key components for us to classify something as invasive. It has to be non-native, has to cause harm. So we get into a little bit of a gray area with the causes harm because it's somewhat subjective, right? What causes harm to me, you may not consider harm, so there's a little bit of subjectivity there, and we'll get to that in a little bit. But let's start here talking about those two components. So apple trees, not native to Michigan. They're from Asia, but we don't consider them invasive because most people don't consider them to cause harm, right? We love apples, especially this time of year. Apple pies, going to apple orchards. We think they do a lot of good in the state of Michigan. So they're non-native, but not invasive. Jeff talked about this one, salmon, right? Pacific salmon, king salmon, coho salmon in the Great Lakes. Not native to the Great Lakes. They were introduced here, but again, not invasive because we generally don't think they cause harm. Most people like the fact that we have a billion-dollar sport fishery in Michigan based around salmon. And there's other benefits that people like with salmon as well. We like to eat them, we like to catch them, we like to see them. So generally there's no harm there. What about alligators? If they were found in Michigan, certainly they would be non-native, but we're not going to consider them invasive because they could not survive in Michigan. They couldn't survive our climate, so they're not going to make it through the winter. So that's another little nuance there is if an alligator was found released in Michigan, somebody had a pet alligator and let it out, we wouldn't, as state agencies, DEQ, DNR, Department of Ag, we wouldn't necessarily be too concerned about that because we know if we wouldn't catch it in time, it would not overwinter here in Michigan. So not considered invasive. Most of you probably recognize invasive mussels, zebra and quagga mussels. Do we know if these are native or invasive? This is kind of the poster child for invasive species in the Great Lakes anyway, right? So these are clearly not from Michigan, and we do think they cause harm. We're going to get into some of those harms in a little bit. What about this guy? Does anybody know this species? Black bear, right? Native to Michigan or invasive or non-native? Native to Michigan, so it is not invasive.
Garlic mustard.
Garlic mustard. Is it native or invasive?
Invasive.
Invasive. So to be invasive, non-native, and it must cause some sort of harm, right? And what about this? This is the Massasauga rattlesnake. Native to Michigan?
Yes.
Yes, this is Michigan's only poisonous snake.
It's actually venomous. Poisonous is if you eat it.
Venomous. Excuse me. I'm a fish guy, so thank you for that. Michigan's only venomous snake, and it is native to Michigan. Even though potentially it could cause human harm, it is native. Why are invasive species bad? And then, maybe more importantly, why should we care? So we're going to switch to that harm piece, causing harm. But first I want to start on that little gray area, the subjectivity that I talked about. Why should you care about invasive species? Well, people tend to protect the things that they know and the things that they love, the things that represent our values, right? This is Pilot Cove on Drummond Island, which is in Lake Huron. And Pilot Cove is this little tiny cove on the northeastern side of Drummond Island. And that's my sailboat that my family and I have gone up to Pilot Cove a couple of different summers and spent time right inside here. And it's really awesome. I mean, you're there all by yourself. You don't see anybody for a week at a time. Great swimming, fishing, playing, family campfires, that kind of thing. Fossils, awesome rocks, cool trees. It's a really neat spot. So that's a value for me, having access to Pilot Cove and how beautiful and serene it is there in Pilot Cove. But if something like Phragmites were to be introduced to the shoreline and grow up and prevent us from going ashore and having those campfires and doing those hikes and just taking away what I consider some of the great scenery in Pilot Cove, that would impact one of my values. So clearly I would care about invasive Phragmites being introduced to Pilot Cove. And I use this example just to kind of touch on the subjectivity of harm. Clearly that is a harm to me because it impacts one of my values. So another way to look at this is taking a trip back in time. 1988. Snapple was first introduced in 1988 with their lemon flavor. That was the first Snapple. Doppler radar was first introduced in 1988. CDs first overtook vinyl in 1988. I sometimes use this presentation or this slide to students, and some of them are starting now not to know what CDs are. So I think I'm going to have to switch, like MP3s first took over CDs, or I don't know, something like that, update it a little bit. Rain Man was the #1 movie in the box office. And 1988 was about the first year that we found zebra mussels in the Great Lakes. It was the last year you could have walked on Great Lakes shorelines without seeing some of the impacts of zebra mussels. We think they were first introduced somewhere probably around Lake St. Clair through the shipping industry, and they've been here ever since. So this kind of hints at why it's really important to prevent invasive species from getting here in the first place. There's some things we can do once they do arrive, but once they're here, they're often here for an eternity. Why else is it important? Well, if you don't care about anything else, the value of being able to camp in Pilot Cove or walk on a beach without stepping on shells, those sort of things, some people think about the money aspect. They're really expensive to control, to maintain, to manage. And these are costs for Michigan. Actually, the Great Lakes spend about $20 million a year controlling invasive sea lamprey. $25 million a year controlling nuisance plants in inland lakes, most of which are invasive. The one pictured is Eurasian water milfoil. And $10 million a year in Michigan are spent controlling zebra mussels, clearing out water intake pipes, removing them from structures, those sorts of things. So they're really, really expensive. It's another reason to care. Yeah?
These numbers are public money that's spent on controlling these things, or is it
so it's not state of Michigan? Yeah, so the middle one there, the $25 million a year on nuisance weed control, is generally money that's spent by lake associations to hire contractors to come in and put herbicide in a lake or to use mechanical means to remove weeds. So it's not necessarily a pot coming from, say, DNR, DEQ to control invasives. It is collectively. The $20 million a year for sea lamprey is something that the Great Lakes Fishery Commission spends on several different approaches that they use to manage sea lamprey, and they get federal dollars, mostly federal dollars, to do that program. So it's a variety of things. It's pooled together.
Because I'm thinking if you're persuading someone about the importance of this, you could just say, well, don't spend money on that, then you wouldn't have to worry about it. So
Exactly.
Are there other estimates in terms of the cost that has on the economy as a whole, or that has on private industries?
There is some of that.
Which I would assume would be more than the amount that they're spending to mitigate.
Yep. There is some of that, and I mentioned the billion-dollar sport fishery in the Great Lakes. So there's studies that show the impact to what is $1 billion. I mean, that sounds huge to me. We have $1 billion sport fishery. Well, it is $1 billion industry when you think about the fuel that's sold for boats and fishing licenses and lures and the tourism industry that's based around coming to Michigan to fish. And there are studies that look at all those things and how that trickles down to your pocket and my pocket. I don't have that with me in today's presentation, but you're right. That's an awesome way to show it. Sometimes those connections are tricky to make for people because it's not a direct connection. There's several steps involved. But sometimes we like to ask that question. So if we did nothing, it's going to cost us much more than $25 million a year to control Eurasian water milfoil, even though that seems like a huge number. So we're going to talk about impacts. This is a shopping cart that was dumped in Grand Traverse Bay, and it sat there for over a year's time. But these are all zebra mussels that hooked to that shopping cart after sitting in the water.
And Disney could buy that for the next Jack Sparrow movie.
Yeah, it's kind of creepy looking. Exactly. So clearly that's an impact of zebra mussels. When I say they cause an impact, they attach to things, man-made things and non-man-made things, as you'll see in a minute, and have impacts. This is the keel of a sailboat. And so, people who own boats in the Great Lakes, whether it's a commercial boat or a private boat, pay big money every year to have their bottoms and hulls scraped and then painted with what they call anti-fouling paint to try and keep things from growing. Doesn't always keep things from growing. As you can see, mussels have found a way to attach to this keel. They clog the water intakes that keep engines cool in things like sailboats and powerboats. So there's a cost to cleaning out that system as well, and the same goes on the commercial side. This is a water intake pipe, and you can see zebra mussels, within one growing season can colonize the inside of an intake pipe, and clearly that's going to reduce flow in and out of that pipe. And so there's big costs in cleaning these out and putting strainers on and cleaning the strainers. So that's where some of those costs that I was talking about associated with zebra mussels come from. And these are clearly impacts. This is one to the economy. They're harmful to the environment too. So this is zebra mussels growing on a native clam we have here in Michigan. And clearly this is going to affect the clam's ability to feed and move around and burrow itself down in the mud like clams like to do. So this is harm to the environment. Maybe this isn't costing us money, but clearly it's costing the clam something. And then harm to human health. You don't think about human health harm when you talk about zebra and quagga mussels, but if you were to walk on this beach, this is Green Bay, a beach in Green Bay, Wisconsin, you would want to wear your flip-flops or maybe something more substantial than flip-flops. If you've ever walked on zebra mussels, they're sharp and they can definitely hurt your feet. So not a beach I want to visit barefooted. Here's another example of kind of an extreme example of harm to human health. This is giant hogweed. It's an invasive species. Looks in this picture a lot like Queen Anne's lace, except that it's like huge, way bigger than Queen Anne's lace. And it has some of the sap inside the stems. If you get it on your skin and then get exposed to UV light from the sun, it actually leaves a burn. So this is a burn on somebody's calf, and you can see kind of the time progression there, but it's a really severe burn. So this is like poison ivy times 10. So this is really bad, blistering, burning, scarring, has the ability to do that. So you don't want to touch giant hogweed. It is found in Michigan. It's invasive, but found in very rare occurrences. If you do find it, Department of Agriculture actually comes out in like hazmat suits to remove it because it is so harmful to humans. So there's rare cases when it causes human harm, and that's not an example I like to use a lot, but there are some examples in Michigan of harm to human health. Sea lamprey, you guys probably recognize this critter. And this is one that causes harm, easy to show harm to the environment, sea lamprey, because it attaches and feeds. It's a parasite, feeds on a lot of our game fish that we like, salmon, trout, walleye. Usually doesn't kill the fish or doesn't kill the fish directly, but the scars they leave can quickly become infected and make the fish weaker, and it eventually probably shortens its life if it doesn't outright kill it.